Okay, now we are going to move on to part 3, the miracle in Philadelphia. Now, I didn't come up with this expression. It's been well used. If I had come up with it, I'd be a much richer man. But this is a description of what happened in Philadelphia. So remember where we were. We had a new country. We were governed by these Articles of Confederation, this sort of loose friendship of states that had been good enough to see us through the war, but now we were starting to see problems with it. So delegates from these 13 colonies all came together to discuss how we can improve these Articles of Confederation to make a more perfect and more lasting union. So, a little background, again, we just went over this. We had 13 separate colonies. Each one, when we say colonies, you basically have to realize we're talking about independent countries. For 100 years, for 150 years, these colonies had been independent. They had been subjects of the British Crown, but they had all had their own governments, they had all had their own systems, their own laws, in some cases their own religions. And some 4 million people lived in the Americas. The governing document, this Articles of Confederation, was a very loose friendship between the states. But these conflicts we kept on seeing made questions about whether or not this document was strong enough to govern. And there was a fear among many of the states and many of the leaders of this government that if we lost unity, if the Articles of Confederation were not strong enough, then that would mean the end of independence for everyone. And so think about it. Why did we win the American Revolutionary War? Well, we won very much because of the French. The intervention both of the French of sending us troops and supplies and of distracting our enemies elsewhere. The English were much, much more powerful than the original colonies, but they could not commit their whole force, their whole efforts to conquering us. Now, as they reestablished peace in Europe, what would happen if the English crown decided to come and retake the colonies? We very well might not be able to stand against them. But if we divided up into 13 separate countries like they had in Europe, we'd almost certainly not be able to stand against them. They would just come one by one and eat us up until nothing was left. And so many people feared that if we weren't able to establish unity, we would end up losing all the progress we had worked for. So each of these colonies, each of these states, sent delegates to this union. There are 73 total delegates, 18 of which declined. 12 of the 13 states sent delegates. Rhode Island did not. They were reluctant in this entire thing. Alexis de Tocqueville referred to these individuals that went as demigods. These were larger-than-life figures in the world. So the average age was 42. I know to most of you, 42 sounds ancient. What you have to understand is that for most people, 42 is really pretty young. Pretty young to be a true expert at these things. In fact, 4 of the most influential were in their 30s. They were my age. They were babies in the world of international politics and of law. Despite the fact that this was a young group of people from a young nation that was somewhat of a rural frontier nation, over half of them had college degrees. 8 of the people who were delegates had signed the Declaration of Independence, 25 had served in the Continental Congress, and 15 had worked in their state constitutions. So think about this for a second. Here you have this rural backwater, which was America at the time. And this sort of collection of loose states, and they were able to come up with these figures, these young men who had such massive experience and such strong philosophical beliefs and understanding that they were able to come together to fight a war, to write the Declaration of Independence, to live by those principles, and then to try to form a more perfect union founded upon these principles. Now, the leader of this was George Washington. George Washington was a larger-than-life figure among larger-than-life figures. He was from Virginia, which was the most powerful and important colony at the time. He had served as a military officer during the French-Indian War. He had been the commander-in-chief during the American Revolution. After the war, he had resigned power, and this was a big one. Many people wanted George to become king. He very easily could have said, I was the victorious general in the field. We have won. It would not have been at all unexpected for a figure like that to then say, I will be the first king of these United States. And honestly, that might have been easier. Because if King George over in England learned that over here they were just trying to set up a new monarchy, he would have understood that. That is something he could have appreciated. But instead they wanted to give power to people. And that was something that no one in Europe could truly understand, and in many cases, something that they actively feared. So he was a larger-than-life figure, and he was elected unanimously to serve as the president of this constitutional convention, this attempt to reform the Articles of Confederation. Now, I'd like to point out our second president, John Adams, had a very different view of Washington. I think he believed that Washington was a great man, but I don't think he agreed with sort of this feeling that we have still to this day that Washington is almost a godlike figure, sort of a founding deity of our republic. So he had made a list later on in life to list out Washington's true virtues, and they're flattering, but not in the way you really want to. You can see he said that Washington was handsome, tall, athletic, which is basically a way of saying he was pretty. He was rich. He was a Virginian, which was important at the time. Lots of people said nice things about him. He was quiet and was able to keep from outburst, and he hid his temper well. Now, you'll notice that missing from this are any of the things we would normally say about a great leader. He was very smart, excellent at administration, insightful, all of those things that we expect from a leader. All of those are missing. According to John Adams, Washington was a sort of superficial choice. Now, I don't know if I agree with him or not. He obviously would know better than me about how Washington really was. But through our history, Washington has truly become this great figure. So we got together, remember, Articles of Confederation, reform the Articles so that we could keep on moving forward. The delegates show up in Pennsylvania, and the first group to show up was Virginia. And since they were first, they decided to get to work and start creating the new plan. They called this plan the Virginia Plan. They said we're going to have a bicameral legislature, meaning that we're going to have a legislature, the group that makes laws, is going to have two different groups in it, an upper and a lower house. So the lower house would change regularly, and representation was based in population. The upper house would be selected by members of the lower house. So basically, population would control who was in the legislature. There'd be three branches of government. There would be a chief executive who could nullify any actions by a state that did not comply with the needs of the Union. And Virginia and Pennsylvania, both large population states, joined in this. Now, this was really good for Virginia, right? Because as we said, Virginia was big, it was powerful, it had a lot of people in it. And so they very much liked the idea of having a government based upon population, because that meant that it was a central government with them in charge. It also was a strong government. The chief executive could nullify acts of the state, meaning that they would, and other large states, would be able to join together to control the government without too much interference from the smaller population states. New Jersey, I should say small state plan, but you'll get over it. New Jersey showed up, and they had a very different idea. They had a small state idea, not shall state, small state idea. This is a response to the Virginia plan called the New Jersey plan. They said we should have a unicameral legislature, no House and Senate, just one group, a Senate. And that each state should have equal representation in that legislative body. Each state gets one vote. Now, this made sense to them because they were an independent country. And why would they give up their ability to be an independent country just to become subservient to Virginia? That wasn't what they had fought the Revolutionary War for. So just like if Germany, France, and Spain formed a new country, you would expect each of those countries to have a vote at the big table, New Jersey wanted the same thing. They said that the president would be selected by Congress. The president would then support a Supreme Court, basically. And ultimately, the New Jersey plan was about keeping and amending the Articles of Confederation, not throwing it out and creating a new constitution. Now, there's also this crazy guy named Hamilton. You probably heard a lot about him lately. He had a third plan, which is sometimes called the British plan. Hamilton, although they don't talk too much about it during their musical, Hamilton basically supported setting up a British model for how the U.S. should work. So states should not be sovereign at all. We'll talk about sovereignty next week, but states should basically not have any control. The central government should have all of the control. Lower and upper bicameral legislature modeled after the House of Lords and House of Commons. The governor, basically the president, should be elected for life, basically an elected king, and have absolute power to veto any bills he disagreed with. State governors should not be elected by people from the states, but instead should be appointed by the central government. And the national legislature could veto any state issue. So basically, he wanted to create a system that was complete control in the hands of the federal government, no control in the hands of the state. He's sort of an outlier. I like to bring him up, especially because Hamilton has become so popular. But he had some ideas that many people didn't agree with. So, as these negotiations started moving forward, we saw three different factions, or three different battlegrounds with each side on them. Factions show up. So the first factions were Federalist versus Anti-Federalist. So the Federalists wanted a strong central government. They believed that we had to have a strong central government to survive. The Anti-Federalists didn't want a strong central government. They wanted strong states and a weak central government. So for the most part, the Anti-Federalists wanted to keep the Articles of Confederation. The Federalists tended to want some new document, a new constitution that would make a stronger central government. So Federalists largely came from urban areas where there was manufacturing and trade, things that required distribution, things that required infrastructure. And so they wanted a government that would support that distribution, that infrastructure. They wanted to make it as easy as possible for them to trade, to make money off of that. Anti-Federalists tend to come from rural areas. They tended to be farmers and plantation owners. They tended to want to establish a government that would allow them to maintain their rights to their property, to their land, to all of those things, and run them how they wanted to. The next battlefield was big states versus small states. So big states had a lot of people in them. And so they said the government should be controlled by population. One man, one vote, right? Now they really liked that idea, mainly because that gave them a whole lot of power. The small states said each government, each of these colonies, each of these states are now independent and sovereign nations. And so any agreement has to treat us all equally, regardless of population. Because even the smallest, lowest population state is still a sovereign and should not be forced to give up that power. We also saw a conflict beginning already between northern states and slave states. Slave states, of course, wanted to keep slavery. Northern states were starting to move towards abolition, the idea that we should not hold anyone enslaved. So here you go, quick map, freed slave states. So when I did this in class, and I really like this is one of my favorite lectures, and unfortunately there's just no way to translate this over. What I had each of you do is, each of the students became a delegate, and I divided you up by states to discuss each of the issue and to vote and pretend you were that state. Obviously, I can't do that here, and it makes me very sad. But maybe next year I'll be able to get back to it. So what we're going to do is work our way through these conflicts that sort of characterized this constitutional convention. So the first big issue that came up was Should we have representation to the legislature based on population, or should it be equal for each state? As I already pointed out, this is one of the major conflicts between the first groups that showed up. How should we manage this? Well, big population states said, we want population to control because that gives us the most power. Small states said, we want everyone equal because we don't want to lose power. So what did we end up with? Well, we ended up with the Connecticut Compromise, also called the Great Compromise. Now, this is one of the first hurdles that had to be jumped through. This was a big stopping point because small states were not interested in having no power. And big states weren't interested in sharing power with the small states. So we had to find a way to make everyone happy before we could tackle any other issue. And so this Great Compromise did that. So we would have a bicameral legislature, which meant that we'd have an upper house and a lower house, two houses that legislature has to go through in order to become law. The upper is called the Senate, the lower is the House. At the time, the Senate was appointed, and there was equal representation in the Senate, meaning that each state got 2 senators, no matter how big or how small. And those senators were appointed by the legislatures of the state, or the governor. Each state was allowed to pick how. Then you had a House, the lower chamber, that was based on population, roughly. This meant that big states had advantage in the House. In order for a bill to become law, the bill had to pass through both the House and the Senate. This meant that in the Senate, everyone had the same say. In the House, big states had more power, but without cooperation, then you couldn't get any bill passed. Now, this Connecticut Compromise is very important. It probably saved the Union, because if they could not have reached a compromise on this issue, nothing else would have mattered. Next, how do we select the chief executive, the president, as he learned later to be called? So, some people said the president should be directly elected by the people. Again, this tended to help large population states, right? Or should he be selected by the representatives? That would tend to be more representative of small states. How should it work? Now, in the end, we ended up with the Electoral College, and we'll talk more about this later. But the Electoral College, basically, when you vote in November for president, the other ones we have more or less direct election, but for president, you're not actually voting for president. Instead, you are voting for a group of representatives who will then head to Washington and vote for president. So basically, you're saying if Democrats win Texas, then you're saying that the Democratic Party gets to pick the electors from Texas to go and vote. If Republicans win, the Republican Party gets to pick electors to go to Washington and vote on our behalf. So basically what happens is each state gets an allotment of electors based upon their congressional delegation, meaning that each state gets 2, 1 for each senator, plus 1 for each congressman. So it's not quite based on population, but it's close. These electors are appointed based on state laws, and then the electors meet and select the president. So again, this was a compromise. It wasn't straight population, direct vote. It also wasn't just having Congress select people. Instead, it was a more complicated system, but that allowed both sides to come together. What about the powers of the president? How much power should the president have? Particularly, how much power should he have to veto acts of Congress? We saw that the Federalists believed that the president should have great power to veto Congress. He should be able to veto anything he doesn't like. In some cases, he should be able to veto acts of states as well. The Anti-Federalists believed that the president should be more limited, that he shouldn't have these unlimited powers to do what he wants. So the compromise was reached that the president can veto acts of Congress, but Congress can then override a veto with a 3/4 vote. So again, an important compromise. It was a strong president, a strong chief executive, but not an absolute chief executive. What about slave trade? Now, this is a big one. What can Congress do to regulate the slave trade? So slavery was, at the time, and it's actually interesting to look historically, at the time of the Revolutionary War, slavery was not very popular. Even people who owned slaves tended to view it as a necessary evil. It's interesting because as we move towards the Civil War, we find that an increasing number of people, especially slave owners, started to refer to slavery not as a necessary evil, but tried to argue that it was actually somehow a social good. So, but at the time, the slave trade was pretty much, everyone agreed, was bad. Particularly the slave trade, which resulted in thousands upon thousands of deaths in the Middle Crossing and untold human suffering. Slave traders were treated very poorly by society and were generally, despite the fact that society allowed slavery, slave traders were treated as second-class citizens and in many places weren't allowed to be buried in the same burial grounds as other people because it was considered such a unworthy profession. But should Congress be allowed to regulate the slave trade? Now, of course, southern states relied on slaves. Northern states did not. And so southern states generally wanted to continue to have the slave trade. So a compromise was reached. And the compromise was that they'd wait 20 years and make a decision later. Not a very satisfying compromise, but there you go. Basically, they said Congress has to wait 20 years to outlaw the slave trade, although they can take some steps to discourage it. But they are not going to be able to just outlaw it immediately. And again, this is a compromise. Basically, what was happening is the Northern Federalists were saying, hey, we need this new Constitution. We need it now. So, this issue is not something we're going to be able to decide. Let's wait on that. Let's say we'll talk about it again in 20 years after we're a strong, secure nation. But for now, let's focus on getting to be a strong, secure nation. What about representation? Now, the southern colonies in particular had a lot of slaves. And if we're going to base representation upon population, do we treat the slaves as citizens for the purpose of representation? Or do we not? Should we count the slaves? Now, of course, northern states said, no, they're not free citizens. You're holding them. We don't want to give up a lot of power to you in this House of Representatives when you're just basing it off of people you're holding in servitude. The southern states said, well, they're there. They need to be counted. They should get some representation. And so, again, this was one you probably heard of. It was a direct compromise. Slaves count as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation. So literally, they almost exactly just cut them in half and said you count as a little bit more than half a person if you are a slave. Now, what about the Bill of Rights? Now, this is important. If you read the Constitution is a limited grant of authority. It is not a you do whatever you want. It spells out certain things, and we'll go over this in more detail later, but it spells out certain things that the new government can do. And it doesn't say anything about, or it says very little about other stuff. Now, the fear among some people, particularly the anti-federalists, is that if we didn't spell out exactly what the government cannot do, that the government will try to do it. Now, the Federalists said, oh, don't be silly. We don't need to spell out what the government cannot do because the U.S. Constitution just says what it can do. So there's no reason to worry about spelling out what it can't do. Everyone will understand that it's a limited grant of power and they can't do anything outside of it. So these issues, this list of can'ts, was not included in the original Constitution. But anti-federalists were not okay with that. So there was an agreement that they would make a list of things the government cannot do. That this would not be part of the Constitution, but that it would be considered immediately after the Constitution was made and ratified as the first amendments to the Constitution. Now, this allowed enough anti-federalists to be swayed, saying, well, okay, we're not dealing with this issue now, but it will be immediately dealt with this is what we call the Bill of Rights. There were more initially discussed. I think there were 13 or so proposed. 10 amendments to the Constitution were passed, and these are the first 10 amendments, and we call that the Bill of Rights. So freedom of religion, militia, guns, the first 10. You can read them. We'll go over them in detail, I promise. We have a whole section dedicated to that. But this was a big deal because these were the first time we were sitting down and saying, federal government, you can't do this. Okay, so we wrote a constitution. We figured out all these big issues. We fought back and forth. We said, we're going to do this. No, we're going to do this. Big fights, right? And so now a question comes. Okay, so we reached an agreement as to what should be in this constitution. We have 13 independent countries. They sent delegates, 12 sent delegates to this thing. We're all going to sit down and we're going to agree, how do we make a new country? How do we make a new law for this country? How do we ratify this Constitution? And that's a big question, right? I mean, what does it mean? So, do we have to get everyone to sign on? If Rhode Island, which didn't send a delegate, says we don't want a new Constitution, does that mean there is no new country? On the other hand, what about a majority? If we say, well, if 7 of the 13 sign on to it, then it's a new government, and we have that. Well, what if the other groups disagree? What if the other 6 say no? Are we going to force them? How do we do this? How do we go from one government being in charge to another government being in charge peacefully? How do we ratify it? And this is amazing because you have to understand the Constitution is I believe the first time in history that we had a completely peaceful revolution. Because that's what this is. They had a form of government, the Articles of Confederation, and they threw it out and created a new one, and not a single shot was fired. It's insane. It's crazy. A complete transfer of power, and not a shot was fired. But how do we get there? What do we do? Well, they came out with this 9 of the 13. They said, if 9 states agree to it, and it's in the Constitution, if 9 states agree to it, then this Constitution is ratified and becomes a new law. Great. What happens if the other 4 don't ratify it? And this is actually interesting, because the first states that ratified it, well, they didn't include Virginia and New York, 2 of the most important states. So what happens if Virginia and New York say no? What happens if the 2 powerhouse states say, nah, we're not going to sign off on this? Well, we don't know, because fortunately they did. Now, Rhode Island, ultimately Rhode Island was the last holdout of the 13. They weren't really involved in the whole thing. Basically what happened was the other 12 colonies threatened to blockade Rhode Island unless they signed on to the new Constitution. So basically it was either sign on or face destruction. And so Rhode Island decided to go ahead and sign on. And so all 13 ratified the Constitution, and we had a new government. Now, we talked about this, Articles of Confederation versus the Constitution. How do they work? You can look at this, but basically the Constitution gave more power to the central government. Bicameral legislature, established a chief executive, established a Supreme Court, all of these other important things. Okay, so that's the end of part 3. This week we're having a 4-parter because I need to go over some of the basic concepts found in the Constitution so that we can all agree to them. So go ahead, take a break, and then we'll come back and talk about the basic structure of the Constitution.